Baruch Hu Shlimeretz Hashem shower besoros tovos upon Am Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael. But with that, let us. The daf is 89. Baruch Hashem, new parak yesterday. A really incredible Gemara ahead of us today, Eretz Hashem. It says as follows: Kol hatadir mechavero kodem es chavero. I will say incredible, absolutely incredible. How right we are all familiar with this concept: tadir v'sheino tadir, tadir kodem. Right, when you have two things, two mitzvos in front of you, and obviously you can't do everything at once. Something has to take precedence. How do you know which one comes first? So there's a rule. Tadir v'sheino tadir, you have two mitzvahs in front of you. One occurs with greater frequency, one occurs with lesser frequency. The mitzvah which occurs with greater frequency ultimately, again, is done first. The Gemara says, so that's the principle of the Gemara. Whatever occurs more frequently than its friend, ultimately, again, takes place before its friend. And therefore, the Mishnah now goes ahead and gives us the application of this. So I will say, it's interesting. The whole yesod of tadir v'sheino, tadir kodem, that's usually how we say it, right? If something is frequent, something is less frequent, the more frequent thing comes first. One of the most incredible things that occurs in Yiddishkeit is a constant reinforcement of the notion that not everything is the same. Right? A lot of times, like in modern society, we think that equality means that everyone and everything is the same, right? That everyone should have the same opportunities, that everyone should be afforded the same treatment. But interestingly enough, fairness, right, or equality doesn't really equal the same. Not everything could be the same, right? Here's the perfect example, right? You have two mitzvahs in front of you. They can't both be done at the same time. Something has to come first, something has to come second. Doesn't mean that the thing that comes second is less important than the first. No, chas v'shalom. It's not a question of, it's just same yisod in Yiddishkeit, right? There are Kohanim, Leviim, Yisraelim. I wish I could do what a Kohen does, but I can't. Does it mean I'm less important than a Kohen? Absolutely not. Just I have a different role. I have a different mission. Equality means that everyone is beloved and everyone is special in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But it does not mean that everybody has the same rights, or everyone has the same opportunities, or everyone could do the same things. Just like you could have two mitzvahs. You can't do them both at the same time. But it doesn't mean that they're not both incredibly beautiful and holy and important. Incredible. So the Gemara goes weiter. Mishnah goes weiter. Hatmidin kodel musavin. So for example, the carbon tamid, supposed to remember, the carbon tamid is brought how often? Every day, twice a day, right? There's a morning tamid, there's an afternoon tamid. Therefore, the tamid comes before the musaf offering. So again, so we're going to talk about there are different types of musafin, but let's say again on Shabbos or on Yom Tiv or on Rosh Chodesh, so halacha l'maaseh, again, you have a carbon musaf, you have a carbon tamid. Which one do you do first? You do the carbon tamid first because it occurs with greater frequency. Musaf. Shabbos kodem l'Musaf Chodesh. Similarly, again, I will say, even in the world of Musaf. Now, this is very interesting. See, what the Mishnah starts with is what we'll call a categorical hierarchy. So, what's the categorical hierarchy? For example, you have two categories of karbanos: tamid and musaf. What comes first if you have a tamid or a musaf? A tamid. Why? Tadir v'sheino tadir, tadir kodem. Or again, kala tadir mechavero kodem es chavero. Whatever occurs with greater frequency ultimately goes first. Tamid occurs with greater frequency more than musaf, therefore that will go first. Now the next statement of the Mishnah is, even within the same category, we still apply the principle. So for example, let's say in a carbon musaf, so you could have Rabbi say Musvei Shabbos. How often are Musvei Shabbos offered up? Every week. As opposed to Musvei Rosh Chodesh. Musvei Rosh Chodesh are offered up once a month. So again, this is very interesting. Even within the same category, we would apply the concept of kol hatadir mechavero, whatever occurs with greater frequency than its friend, kodem es chavero, is offered up before its friend. Next, Musaf Rosh Chodesh, kodem l'Musaf Rosh Hashanah. Similarly again, the Musaf of Rosh Chodesh will be offered up before the Musaf of Rosh Hashanah. Shene'emar, as the pasuk says, milvad olas haboker, asher li olas hatamid, ta'asu es eila. So I said this is very interesting. So remember again, so this last category is same idea. Musaf Rosh Chodesh, so again, Musaf Rosh Chodesh, come before the Musaf of Rosh Hashanah. How do we know that? Now, interestingly enough, the pasuk that the Gemara quotes is by Pesach. The pasuk says, "Milvad olas haboker asher li olas hatamid." So literally translated, aside from the olas haboker, aside from the morning ola, which is referring to the karban tamid. Asher li olas hatamid, then it says, which is the karban tamid. Ta'asu es ela. You shall do these. What's the these? These are the offerings of Pesach. So what do you see from here? You see from here that halacha l'maisa, ultimately again, the Musaf of Rosh Chodesh comes before the Musaf of Rosh Hashanah. Now how exactly you're seeing that from that pasuk, we'll take a look at this. Take a look at Rashi just a moment. The Rashi says, Ka'ila ta'asu, basar hahu kra, dimilvad alos haboker, ta'asu es ela. Ksiv ka'ela ta'asu mashma kaseder sha'amarti lecha ka'ela shamayla kashem sha'tadir kodim kain seder musaf. So we're going to see in the Gemara that interestingly enough, the drasha is not actually from that pasuk, right? The drasha is actually from the following pasuk, as we'll get into. But in any event, the Mishnah says, how do we know that even within the category of musafin, the concept of tadir applies? Shene'emar milvad alos olas haboker asher li olas hatamid ta'asu es ela. Frankly, I'm shocked that I did not hear a ringing out of Ka'ela. Come on, clever. I know it's early, but all right. I see some of you are thinking it. This is thinking. All right, good. Anyway, so we're going to get to the Ka'ela in just a little bit. So it says the Gemara. So we'll say Minalan. From where do we know this concept? Now the Gemara says, what do you mean? What do you mean minalan? So we'll say, what are you talking about? So first of all, here's what I want to point out. The Mishnah ends off with this pasuk, right? And what the pasuk tells me is something very simple, which is milvad alos haboker shali olas hatamid katasu es ela. The Torah is seemingly telling me that the olas haboker, the karban tamid, comes before the additional offerings of Pesach. So if nothing else, what that pasuk is telling me is that halacha l'maisa, the tamid comes before any musaf or any Yom Tov offerings. So already, again, out of the gate, the pasuk does teach me the concept of tadir. So now the Gemara starts off by saying minalan. From where do we know this concept? The Gemara says minalan. The Mishnah quotes a pasuk. The Mishnah tells me the pasuk says it pretty explicitly. That again, you're going to offer up all the karbanos of Pesach, milvad olas haboker. Again, aside from the olas haboker, and it's placing the olas haboker first. So it's telling you do the karban tamid first, and then you'll do the offerings of Pesach. To which the Gemara says, 1 second, Dilma t'midin heim dekadmu lemusafin mishum detadiri musafin lemusafin minal. The Gemara says, fine. All the pasuk. What does the pasuk teach me? The pasuk teaches me that halacha l'maisa, a karban tamid comes before a musaf, right? Because that's actually what the pasuk is telling me. So maybe the concept of tadir is limited in its reach. The concept of tadir will tell me that a karban tamid will come before a musaf, but that's not what that is what I'm looking for. But I'm also looking for another detail in that, which is, how do I know that even within the same category of karbanos, for example, a karban musaf, that will still apply the concept of tadir, because remember again, not every karban musaf is created equal, right? Remember again, musaf of Rosh Chodesh occurs every single month. Musaf of Rosh Hashanah occurs once a year. Musaf of Pesach we're going to see is for 7 days. So the Maisa, how do I know that the concept of tadir applies even within musafin? To which the Gemara says, musaf l'musaf minalan, Amar Rabbi Yilai, Amar Kra, Ka'ela. Ka'ela ta'asula yom shivas yomim. So Rabbi says, so amazingly enough, the pasuk says Ka'ela. Now again, Rabbi said these psukim are follow one after the other. So first is the pasuk that the Mishnah quoted. Mevad olas haboker shali olas hatamid ta'asu es ela. So remember that pasuk tells me that halacha l'maisa. You have the Talmud Shal Shachar, and you have the Karbanos of Pesach, and then it says Ka'ela ta'asu layom shivas yomim. Now Ka'ela means what? Like these. like these, you shall go ahead and do for 7 days. So the Gemara says, Da'amakra, ka'ela ta'asul yom shivas yomim. Eila ka'ela. These are like these. Now what does this mean? Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, it's the first wide line, ka'ela ta'asu, basar hahu kra, Milvad olas haboker ta'asu es eleksiv ka'ela ta'asu mashma keseder sha'amarti lecha ke'ela shalmala. So we'll say what it means is like this. The ka'ela is teaching me that halacha l'maisa, the same order that I created in the pasuk beforehand. What was the order that was created in the first pasuk? Right? Milvad olas haboker asher olas hatamid. What was the order that was created? That tamid comes before musaf. The next pasuk then says ka'ela. The same order that you created in the previous pasuk will also exist now in this pasuk. Now the second pasuk of ka'ela is talking about what? Only musaf offerings. And what does that teach you? The same way that I espoused the concept, or that we embedded the concept of tadir in the previous pasuk. So, and that pasuk told me that tamid comes before musaf. So too ka'ela, the subsequent karbanos will be treated in the same way, and that even in the realm of musafin, we will apply the concept of tadir. Mashma kisam, I'm just finishing up that Rashi. Mashma kiseder shamarti lecha ke'ela shamayla kishim sha tadir kodem kach seder hamusafin shim yom sheyesh beis musafin kegom b'shabbos shebesoch haregal. That will say, where would this come up in Pesach? Rashi points out over here. So we'll see here, this is a fascinating drasha. So therefore, the first pasuk teaches me milvad alas haboker sheli alas hatamid, teaches me the concept of tadir, right? Teaches me the carbon tamid comes before the karbanos of musaf. The second pasuk of ka'ela then comes along and says the same way that tadir applies between tamid and musaf, so to ka'ela, even in the realm of musafin, ultimately the concept of tadir will apply. Incredible. So the Gemara says, and we'll say, by the way, where will that come up on Pesach? So Rashi points out, on the Shabbos Pesach, right? Shabbos Pesach, this will come up because on Shabbos Pesach, what will you have? You'll have the Musaf of Shabbos and you'll have the Musaf of Pesach. Which one comes first? The Musaf of Shabbos, because of Tadir V'Sheino Tadir Kodem. Incredible. Beautiful. The Gemara says as follows: but 1 second, I need that pasuk of ka'ela for its own drasha. In other words, what's its own drasha, Bosai? To teach me that halacha l'maisa. Remember that there's a carbon musaf all 7 days of Pesach. Because if it were just for the first pasuk, I would have thought that there's only a carbon musaf on the first day of Pesach. That second pasuk is actually needed to teach me that there's a carbon musaf every single day of Pesach. As such, it's not free to go ahead and teach these other drashas. To which the Gemara says, Imkei nichtov eile ta'asu layom. If that's the case, the pasuk could have just said, these shall be performed throughout the days of Pesach. Why do you need ka'ela? I kasev eile ta'asu layom shivas yamim. So I'll say, because if would have just said, these are the karbanos that you should offer up the 7 days, hava amina eile l'shiva hayamim. I would have thought like this. Well, it's actually very interesting. I would have thought, if it would have just said eile tasu layom, I would have thought like this, that maybe there are 7 karbanos that are offered up over Pesach, 1 for each day. Ka'ela actually comes to teach me ultimately that's what? That it's 7 per day. Therefore, again, the Gemara says, Hava mina eila l'shivas yomim, therefore l'yom ksiv. V'akati, ema eila l'yom, aval shar yomi lo yedana. But even so, I would have said like this. I still would have thought that if it would have just said liyom, I would have thought that there are 7 karbanos for the first day, and I don't know what you do on the rest of the days of Pesach. To which the Gemara says, I'm sorry, Avashar Yomei lo yedana kama. Amakra ta'asu shehei kol hasios shavos. Therefore, the pasuk says ta'asu, so it's ka'ela ta'asu, meaning just like on the first day you offer up 7, so too again on the subsequent days you offer up 7, and ta'asu means the 7 days or the following days should be an exact replica of the first. Abai Amar, therefore both say Abai Amar, migufet tikra. So Abai said, let's go back. We'll both say full circle. Remember again, what are we trying to figure out over here? We're trying to figure out, first there were really 2 questions. Question number 1 was, Where do we learn the concept of tadir? Kala tadir mechavero, kodem es chavero, or as we normally colloquially state it, tadir v'sheino tadir, tadir kodem. Where do we learn that concept from? So the Gemara says, that question was really answered by milvad olas haboker asher li olas hatam. By Pesach. Pasuk explicitly says, Karban Tamid comes before the Musan ultimately of Pesach. That's question one. What's question two? So I understand that the concept of Tadir applies from category to category. How do I know that the concept of Tadir applies within the same category? So for example, even within the Musaf family, how do I know that I create a Tadir hierarchy? So then the Gemara Darshan, Ka'ela tasu layom, right? Ka'ela, just like you did on the first day of Pesach, so you should do on the second day, the third day, the fourth day, all the days of Pesach, which then tells me that even on Shabbos of Pesach, when you have two different musafin, right? Musaf of Shabbos, Musaf of Pesach, also apply the concept of Tadir. But the Gemara asked a whole bunch of questions on that. Abaye says, no. Abaye Amr Megufa Tikra. No. We learn it out from that pasuk, as we mentioned before. The Gemara says, Imkain Lemakra Milvad Olas Haboker Vitishtok. Because otherwise the pasuk could have said, Milvad Olas Haboker. Now, the pasuk could have said, Milvad Olas Haboker, Milvad Olas Haboker, Ta'asu Es Ela. Which would have told me, go ahead and do the Karban Tamid, and then go ahead and offer up the Pesach offerings. Why do you need to state the phrase Asher li Olas HaTamid? We'll say, there's only one Olas HaBoker. That's the Karban Tamid. Why do you have to say Milvad Olas HaBoker Asher li Olas HaTamid? Why do you need that? To which the Gemara says, Im Kim Mikra Milvad Olas HaTamid V'tishtok Asher li Olas HaTamid Lamali L'meimar Dahach D'Tadira Tikdum. Sabai says that's the principle. The principle says Milvat Olas HaBoker. Why? Why does the Olas HaBoker go first? Asher li Olas HaTamid. Because it is the Tamid, because it occurs with greater frequency. Therefore, Abaye says that halacha l'maisa, that phrase ultimately again indicates to me that the pasuk is not simply coming to teach me a detail by Pesach, but rather again the pasuk itself is coming to go ahead and teach me a fundamental principle, which is a guiding light principle of tadir mechavero, kodem es chavero. Whatever occurs with greater frequency, ultimately again will always come first. Therefore, I will say this is very exciting because from this sugya we now emerge with a new principle. The biblical concept of Tadir V'Sheino Tadir Tadir Kodem comes from Milvad Olas HaBoker Asher Li Olas HaTamid. That's where the concept comes from. First day Pesach, you have your Karban Tamid, you have your Karbanos of Pesach. Ultimately, again, which one comes first? The Karban Tamid. Why? Milvad Asher Li Olas HaTamid. Because since the Tamid occurs with greater frequency, therefore it will come first. How do I know that the concept applies even within the same category of Karbanos? Next pasuk, Ka'ela ta'asu layom shivas yamim. Ka'ela, the same way you operated on the first day, this is the guiding light principle for all the subsequent days. Which means that even when you come to Pesach, Shabbos Pesach, and you're going to have two different musafin, the musaf of Shabbos, the musaf of Pesach. Musaf of Shabbos goes first. Why? Tadir v'sheino tadir, tadir kodem. Incredible. Both sides following on those same lines. Mishnah. Kol mekudesh mechavero, kol meschavero. Suppose I listen to this. Anything that is holier than its friend, ultimately again comes before its friend. Now I'll say Rashi says over here, this is actually very interesting. How do you gauge that? Right? How do you gauge what's holier than something else? To which Rashi says, Sheyesh bot sad ribui kedusha mimenu. So the way we gauge kedusha is something that has more details, right? More details attached to it. Yesh bot sad ribui. There are more details or more aspects to it than its fellow. That's how we are gauging kedusha in this context. You'll see it illustrated. So again, remember, these principles are building on each other. So again, principle number one is tadir v'sheino tadir tadir kodem. Principle number two ultimately is whatever is more kaddish than its friend will come before its friend. Here we go. For example, dam chatos kodun dam ha'ola b'bnei shumarasa. So the blood application of a chatos will come before the blood application of an ola. Why? Because chatos affects atonement. It affects atonement. So again, what this means is you shechted two karbanos. Yeah, I remember again, I was saying something, for example, let's say with the chatas and an ola, lav dafka that you could use the concept of tadir. Or by the way, remember, tadir also only applies when it's one person doing it. But let's say you have multiple kohanim shechting karbanos. So now again, I have a kohen did a chatas, kohen did a ola. The blood is ready to go for both of them. Which one do you do the blood application for first? So the Mishnah says chatas comes first. Why? Because chatas has a detail that ultimately again ola doesn't, which is chatas affects atonement, and therefore that makes chatas, so to speak, more kaddish. And because it's more kaddish, therefore again it goes first. A vari ola called le'imuri chatas. And interestingly enough, the burning of the sacrificial parts of an ola are done before the burning of the sacrificial parts of chatas. Why? Because ola is fully consumed on the mizbeach, whereas chatas is not, right? Part of chatas is eaten by kohanim. Therefore, again, that gives it a higher level of kedusha. Chatas kodemes la'asham. Chatas comes before an asham. Now, that's interesting. Why? Because both chatas and asham are what? Both sin offerings. B'yat chatas comes first. Mipnei shedama nitan ledalid kranas al yisod. Because chatas has blood application on all four corners, whereas asham only has two. Furthermore, again, chatas has its blood also applied on the base. The base of the mizbeach. Therefore, chatas goes first. Asham koda latoda ve'el nazir. Asham comes before a toda, carbon toda, Thanksgiving offering, and el nazir, which is one of the offerings of the nazir when he completes his nazirus. Why? Mipnei shu kachek hadashim. Because asham is kachek hadashim, whereas a toda and an el nazir are kachim kalim. Good. Toda ve'el nazir kol min l'shlamim. Toda and an el nazir come before shlamim. Why? Mipnei shehein ne'echalin liyom echad u'tu'unin lechem. Because both a toda and an el nazir, number one, have a shorter window of consumption, only 1 day. Only 1 day, as opposed to shlamim, which has 2 days, and furthermore, toda and el nazir come with bread, come with loaves. Right, as opposed to shlamim, which does not. So I will say again, what you see over here is anytime something has either a stricture or an additional detail over something else, the Mishnah frames that as it's more kaddish. It's more kaddish. Interesting. So the Gemara says hashlamim kodin lebechar. So similarly again, shlamim come before bechar. Why? Mipnei sheim tu'unin matan dalid usmicha. Shlamim comes before a bechar offering. Why? Because ultimately, again, shlamim has tuna matan dalid, has blood applications, 4 blood applications, and smicha. Unisachim utenufos chazei v'shok. It has libations. It has a waving of the chest and the thigh as well. Okay. Habechar kodem lamaiser. Bechar is offered up before Meiser Behema. Why is that? Because again, Bechar is sanctified from the womb, and ultimately again it's consumed only by the Kohanim. HaMeiser Kodem LaOfos. So Meiser Behema comes before Ofos, any bird offerings. Why? Zevach. Because Meiser still has the status of a bona fide carbon, whereas we've seen already extensively, bird offerings are treated differently. V'yeshbo kodesh kadashim damo ve'imura. Furthermore, again, Meiser is still treated like kodesh kadashim in that what? In that there's a blood application and a burning of sacrificial limbs. Ha'ofos Cold min liminachos. So ophos, bird offerings, come before mincha offerings. Why? Because at least by bird offerings there is still a blood application. Minchas chote called them the minchas nadava. And I both say, okay, so up until now, remember again, we've been dealing with categorically dissimilar items. I will say, what about now within the same category? So for example, minchas chote, called them the minchas nadava. So we'll say, for example, now we're going to see this hierarchy is in effect even within the same category of kabbalah. So for example, let's say you have a karban mincha. One is a minchas chote, one is a mincha that's brought as a sin offering, and one is a minchas nadava, voluntary mincha. Which one goes first? So the Mishnah says the minchas chote comes before the minchas nadava. Why? Mipnei shehu ba'al chet. Ultimately, again, obviously, because the minchas chote is a sin offering. So the fact that it's a sin offering puts it on a higher pedestal than the minchas nadava. Chatas ha'of kol demes la'olas ha'of v'chein be'akdesh. Similarly, again, I will say, this is actually interesting. So to the chatas ha'of will come before the olas ha'of, Once again, because the chatas ha'of is coming as a sin offering, as opposed to the ola that it's not v'chein behagdesha. Now, but it's interesting if you take a look at the last Rashi on the daf, which is the last line of Rashi, v'chein behagdesha kishumefarish eskino kore shem lachatas tchilas. So remember, we're talking about someone who's bringing a bird pair. This could be like the simple case of this is like a zav, right? So the Sof to the Mishnah says when you're designating the birds, remember again which one is going to be a chatas and which one is going to be an ola. The same way that the chatas is offered up, before the ola, so too the designation of the chatas is done before the ola. Incredible. Rabbi say that is the end of the Mishnah, creating this incredible hierarchy of sacrificial items based on their kedusha. Rabbi say now what I want to point out over here is a tremendous Musar Haskell. It's fascinating to see. Remember again how we started the Mishnah. How do you determine what's more kaddish than something else? Right? In the world of kedusha, how do you do that? Right? Everything is holy. So how do you determine holiness hierarchy? How do you do that? So remember again, Rashi gave us a definition. Rashi said sheyesh bo tzad ribui kedusha mimenu. Rashi says that greater kedusha is found in more details. And I will say that is a tremendous Musar Haskell for us as well. The simple path to greater personalistic holiness is do more. Now again, sometimes doing more is not always the answer to self-actualization, right? For example, the mashal I often give is, a person could stand by the street corner helping, old people cross the street the whole day, right? Is that a day well spent? So it's beautiful, and that's a tremendous chesed. Do I self-actualize through that? Maybe yes, maybe no. If that's my shlichus in this world, that's fantastic. But if I'm supposed to be accomplishing a whole bunch of other things, then I'm missing the mark. You could spend your life doing good things, lav dafka, that you're doing what you were put on this earth to do. So much of life is figuring out it's just like I could learn a million different things at once. Right? Now again, the problem with learning a million different things at once is lav dafka that I'm retaining or growing in any specific way. It's certainly good, it's certainly beautiful, but is that the avodah? So a lot of life is figuring out what's my directed mission. But sometimes it takes a long time to figure that out. So what do you do in the interim? As much as you can. There is kedusha in the ribui. And when we find ourselves, especially in a rut, in a bad place in life, and we just find that, I'm not feeling it. I'm not connected. I'm not plugged in. Rashi says the secret to kedusha is ribui. Learn more, do more, give more. Just more and more. More and more is not always the answer to everything. Because sometimes too much is like, I'm too diffused, I'm too all over the place. Yes, you have to find your directed derech. But sometimes until you could find your directed derech, do as much as you can. Because the more you do, one thing is clear, the more kedusha there is. And the more kedusha there is, the better the probability that over time you will find your directed path. As Rashi HaKadosh says, Yesh bo tzad ribui kedusha mimenu. The more you're doing, the more kedusha you have, and the more kedusha you have, the better the probability that over time you will find your shlichos, you'll find your directed path. Incredible. Says the Gemara, from where do we know this? The Gemara is asking over here a very interesting anomaly. If you notice, the Mishnah said that dam chatos comes before dam ola. Okay? Yet, interestingly enough, you burn the limbs of the ola before the sacrificial parts of the chatos. Right? So remember again, what was the logic behind that? So the blood of the chatos comes before the blood of the ola because the blood of the chatos affects atonement, the blood of the ola does not. But yet you burn the limbs of the ola before the chatos because the limbs of the ola are totally consumed and the chatos is not. So the Gemara says, from where do you know that? Where do you know that? The Gemara says, the Tan Rabbanon, upar sheni ben bakar tikach lachatos. The pasuk says, they shall take a second ben bakar, a second par, ben bakar, ultimately again for a chatos. Now, I just want to point out context. Rashi says over here, upar sheni ben bakar, bechino chalavim ksiv ba'aloscha. This is talking about the inauguration, the consecration of the Levium. Okay, so the Gemara says, Im ba l'lamed shem shnayim. So if he's coming to teach me that there are two chatos offerings, or that you should take the second par as a chatos, the Gemara says, so again, if you're telling me that there's two paros, that there's two parim, that there's two ox offerings, two cow offerings, so we already learned that before. It already said, take one as a chatos and one as an olah. So the Gemara says, so why you, in other words, what the Gemara is asking over here is, why do you have to say parsheni? I already know that there's two cows, right? And I already know that one is for a chatas and one is for an olah. So just say, take the chatas. What do you mean parsheni ben bakar tikach lachatas? Why do you need that? The Gemara says, listen to this. Parsheni ben bakar tikach lachatas sheyachol shechatas kodemes chol maseh olah. You might have thought that a chatas, in all of its aspects, right? All the aspects of chatas should come before an olah. Talmud lomar uparsheni ben bakar tikach lachatas. No, but the pasuk says you shall take a second cow as a chatas. What does that show you? That in certain respects the olah comes before the chatas. Okay. I parsheni yachol te olah kodemes lachatas l'chol maseh. So then maybe, since the Torah is calling the chatas the second cow, so it must be that maybe the olah comes before the chatas for everything. Talmud lomar va'aseh es ha'echad chatas. Here's the problem. It says you shall do one of them as a chatas and one of them as an olah. What's the order over here? It's putting the chatas first. Rabbi say, see the problem? See the problem? I know that I'm taking both a chatas and an olah for the consecration of Leviim. Which one comes first? The psukim are contradictory. One pasuk seems to indicate that halacha l'maisa again, the olah comes first, and the second pasuk seems to indicate that the chatas comes first. So which one is it? Ha said, here we go. Dam chatas kodemes ladam olah mipnei shemiratze evare olah v'chulei. So Gemara says, I can tell you, I can reconcile it. The answer is it's both. In certain respects, in certain areas, the chatas comes before the olah. Which case is that? That's the blood application, right? That's the blood. So blood application of chatas comes before an olah. Why? Because blood application of a chatas atones. Blood application of an olah does not. But yet, when it comes to the burning of the sacrificial limbs, the olah will be done before the chatas. Why? Because the olah is fully consumed on the mizbeach, and ultimately, again, the chatas is not. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. Velama. So the Gemara says, Amai, va'amai, matana kamai sedem echarpa tikda, mahanach lo. Now, here's what's interesting. When it comes to blood applications, what the Gemara was suggesting is all of the blood applications of chatas precede the olah. But why is that? Remember again, back already, this is going back to the beginning of Zevachim. How many blood applications do you need in order to affect atonement? One. Right? All you need is that first blood application and you are good to go. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. Why should all of the blood applications of chatas precede the blood applications of the olah? Just do the first blood application of chatas, kapara is achieved, and then do the rest of the olah. Ravina says, no. So Ravina says, this is a different kind of chatas over here. This actually, remember again, the pasuk is talking about the chatas of the olah. Chatas of the Leviim. And even though in many respects it is similar to an olah, the Torah nevertheless said that it should still take precedence. They gave a simpler answer. Once you started the blood applications, finish it up. In other words, they're both saying, in this discussion of kedimos, which takes precedence, it wouldn't make sense to say that do one of the 4 blood applications of the chatas, then do the blood applications of the olah, and then finish up the blood applications of the chatas. Once you started it, finish it. I will say another tremendous Musar Haskell. They said, what's the secret to success? Gomer. If you start something, finish it. Start something, finish it. How many of us have a closet, right? The life closet that is filled with half-started life initiatives, half-started dreams, goals, and aspirations that then get shelved when they lose their new dream or new initiative smell. If you start something, do your best to bring it to completion. That's what it says. Now the Gemara asks just a whole bunch of really interesting related questions. Dam chatos ve'evare olah. So remember again, the Mishnah obviously created this hierarchy of sacrificial service, right? Based on the concept of whatever is more kaddish than its friend comes first. How are we defining kaddish? Kaddish is either defined as more details or more strictures. Now, and then the Mishnah gave specific examples. The Gemara now is going to ask some variations on this. Ibaylahu, dam chatos ve'ivare ola. So listen to this. If you have a choice, or you have two things over here: the blood of chatos and burning. So that's the blood application and the burning of the limbs of ola. Which one comes first? Now, again, the Mishnah didn't talk about this case, right? The Mishnah spoke about blood of chatas versus blood of ola, and then blood of chatas comes first, and then limbs of chatas, limbs of ola get burned first. So now the Gemara is kind of mixing and matching the case a little bit. Let's say you have in front of you now, I could either apply the blood of the chatas or burn the limbs of the ola. Which one comes first? On one hand, dam chatas kodem mipnei shemaratzah, the blood of the chatas should come first because it affects atonement. The Gemara says, Odilma, a vari ola kol mishein kalishim, or the limbs of the ola should come first. Why? Because they're fully consumed on the mizbeach. So let's analyze. So tashma dam chatas kodel dam ola. Dam chatas comes before dam ola. So Gemara says, the dam ola hu dekadim leivare ola lo kadim. So what do you see from here? The blood of the chatas only comes before the blood of the ola, but not before the limbs of the ola. Adrabah, because it's just the opposite. Adrabah miseifa evare ola kodel leimure chatas. The limbs of an ola burning of limbs. Whenever I say limbs, I mean burning of limbs of the ola comes before the burning of limbs of the chatas. Leimuri chatas hu dekadim ledam chatas lo kadim. The limbs of an ola will come before the limbs of a chatas, but limbs of an ola never come before the blood application of a chatas. So which one is it? Ella meha leka lemashma minei. So the Gemara essentially says you can't derive an answer to this question from our Mishnah. So Rabbi say open-ended question over here. Which would come first, the blood of an ola or the burning of the limbs of the blood of a chatas or the burning of the limbs of an ola? That question remains open. Next, ibaylahu. So the Gemara says, good. Ibaylahu. Dam ola ve'imure chatas. If you have the blood of an ola and the limbs of a chatos, so the Gemara says, Eiza mehen kodem, which one should come first? On one hand, dam ola kodem, dika'asi mikoach kalil. On one hand, they will say, by the way, I'll point out the Rambam Paskins, in that previous case, dam chatos comes first. Dam chatas will come. Well, by the way, the general rule is that blood applications will almost always come before burning of sacrificial limbs. That's the general rule. But again, the Gemara is working through it. Next, dam ola ve'imure chatas ezimei kodem. Which one comes first? The blood of an ola or the burning of the sacrificial limbs of a chatos? So the Gemara says, dam ola kodem deka'asi mikoach kalil. So on one hand, I should say maybe the blood applications of an ola should come first. Why? Because ola has greater kedusha in general. Why? Because it's totally consumed in the mizbeach. Oh dilma, both say first white line. Oh dilma imure chatas kodmin. Maybe the burning of the limbs of a chatas should come first. Why? Deka'asi mikoach mechaper. Because a chatas affects atonement. So let's analyze. So tashma dam chatas kodem dam ola. So the Mishnah said that the blood of a chatas comes before the blood of an ola. So dafka dam chatas hu dekadim leil dam ola. Aval emure chatas lo. What do you see from here? It's only the blood application of chatas. It's only blood of chatas that comes before the blood of an ola. But if it's a choice between blood of the ola and burning of the limbs of a chatas, of course you'll go with the blood of the ola. Adrabah, I can say just the opposite. Adrabah miseifa, I'll say third wide line. Adrabah miseifa, a vare ola kolmule more chatas. The limbs of an ola come before the burning of the limbs of a chatas. It's only the limbs of an ola that come before the limbs of a chatas. Aval dam ola lo. But the blood of an ola will not become before the limbs of a chatas. Ella, the Gemara says, you're right. We cannot derive a conclusion based on the teachings of the Mishnah. I will say once again, the Rambam Paskins in this case, blood of an ola will ultimately again come before the limbs of a chatas. Again, which makes sense. Blood service, which is really the ikar of the carbon, will always come before. So if you have a blood service of one carbon, burning of sacrificial limbs of another carbon, the blood service will almost always come first because again, that's the ikar avoda of the carbon. Good. Ibaylahu dam ola v'dam asham. Interesting case over here. What about the blood of an ola, blood of an asham? Eiza mehen kodem. So again, remember again, these are cases not covered by the Mishnah. So dam ola v'dam asham. Eiza mehen kodem. So ultimately, again, if you have the blood of an ola, blood of an asham, which one comes first? So the Gemara says, dam ola kodem dika'asi mikoach So on one hand, I could say maybe the blood of an Ola should come first. Why? Because remember again, the Ola has this additional Kedusha. What's the additional Kedusha of the Ola? That is totally consumed on the Mizbeach. Or on the other hand, O Dilma, Dam Asham Kodem de Mechaber. Now both remember again, an Asham is a sin offering. Because it's a sin offering, therefore what? It atones. So as we saw before, right? As we saw before, the power of atonement, which by the way is another tremendous Musar Haskell, right? And in the world of Karbanos, what's the most powerful force? Atonement. Atonement. That's the greatest form of Kedusha. So on one hand, maybe an Asham should come first because an Asham has the power of atonement. The Gemara says, Tashma, let's analyze. Tashma. Dam chatas kodulim dam ola. So the blood of the chatas comes before the blood of an ola. Aval dam asham lo. But not right. So ultimately, again, so dam chatas will come before the blood of an ola. But ultimately, again, not dam asham. I could infer from that it's dafka chatos that goes before an ola. But I could infer from that an asham would not go before an ola. That an ola would come first. So therefore, I'm going to say that's the Gemara shaila. So the Gemara says bedinhu. In reality, bedinhu di boile misnei dam asham. The truth is, the Gemara says really. I can make the argument that both dam chatas and dam asham come before dam ola. I said, why didn't it write it that way? Va'aydi debayla misne seifa a vare ola komen le'emure chatas. Since at the end of the Mishnah I wanted to write that the limbs of an ola come before the limbs of a chatas, di tana le'emure asham, because had it just said asham, hava amina le'emure asham hu dekadmi, le'emure chatas lo kadmi. I would have thought that it's dafka the limbs of an asham that an ola precedes, but not the limbs of a chatas. Mishum hachi tana chatas. Therefore, again, the Mishnah said chatas. But in reality, the same way that the blood of a chatas precedes the blood of an ola, so too the blood of an asham ultimately again should also come before the blood of an ola. So tashma. So we're not finished with this. Tashma. Chatas kodem la asham. A chatas comes before an asham. Chatas hu dekami le asham ava ola. It's dafka a chatas that comes before an asham, but not an ola. In other words, that an ola would not precede an asham. My lav dam. Are we not talking about the blood applications? And from here you see that the blood of an ola should come before the blood. The blood of an asham should come before the blood of an ola. Lo aemurim. No, rather it's referring to the sacrificial parts. That ultimately, again, the sacrificial parts of an asham maybe should come before the sacrificial parts of an ola. Take an ami diktani mipnei shedama nitan. Ultimately, I will say, what do you see from here? You see from here that halacha l'maisa, the Mishnah itself says, because there are blood applications. Therefore, shmamina. Therefore, most of the Gemara says that is correct. So bottom line, by the way, over here, also the way the Rambam paskins is that halacha l'maisa, the blood of an ola ultimately comes before the blood of an asham. Okay, fine. So the Gemara goes weiter. Chatas kodemes. Chatas kodemes. So the Gemara says, remember again, now, in the realm, remember, there are two different levels over here. The same way that in the discussion about Tadir V'Sheino Tadir Kodem, we had kind of like two levels, which was first categorical Tadirus, and then within the same category, establishing a hierarchy as well. So to a certain degree, the Mishnah did that over here also. First creates this concept, whatever is more kaddish than its friend, ultimately again goes first. And again, comparing carbon to carbon, but then showing us that even within the same category, the concept still applies as also, for example, in the realm of sin offerings. Chatas and asham are both sin offerings. Yet what's the halacha? Chatas comes before an asham. So the Gemara says, Chatas kodemes. The Gemara says, I don't understand why that is. Adraba, asham kadim. In reality, an asham should come before a chatas. Why? Sheken yeshvo kitzva. So it's actually very interesting. So Rashi points out over here, an asham has a minimum value. Rashi says, Sheish kitzva, ledamav dechsev, bekesef shkalim, avachatas koldu. Interestingly enough, the Torah gives a minimum value for an asham, 2 shkalim. 2 shkalim, right? But interestingly enough, there is no minimum value for a chatas. So I might have thought that this represents a stricture that asham has over chatas. If that's the case, that should make asham more kaddish than chatas, and it should come first. To which the Gemara says, Afilu hachi ribui demizbeach adif. To which the Gemara says, because remember again, chatas has more blood applications. Chatas has 4 blood applications. Asham has 2. That makes it more kaddish. In other words, even though Asham has this financial stricture, because chatas has more details regarding the mizbeach, that makes it more kaddish. Incredible. Asham kodem latoda. An Asham comes before a toda. The Gemara says, Adraba. The Gemara says, Asham kodem latoda. Adraba hatoda ve'el nazir kadmi shekein tu'unim lechem. Still, I don't understand why that is. The Gemara. So remember, the Mishnah said Asham comes before a toda and an el nazir. Toda and el nazir are linked together. To which the Gemara says, but I don't understand why that should be. Toda and el nazir should come before Asham. Why? Because they come with loaves. They come with accompanying lechem. Shouldn't that make them more kaddish? Afilu hachi kadshe kadoshim adifi. Nevertheless, again, Asham is kadshe kadoshim. Toda and El Nazir are kadshim kalim, and therefore Asham comes first. Toda ve'el Nazir. So Toda and El Nazir comes before Shlamim. Adrabah, Shlamim Kadmi, Shlamim should come first. Why? Shekain Yeshnan B'tzibor Kibiyachid. Interesting enough, Rabbi say the concept of carbon Shlamim, there is an individual Shlamim and there's communal Shlamim. Rashi gives the example of Kivsi Atzeres, the lambs that are offered up on Shavuos. Ultimately, again, as opposed to Toda and El Nazir are private karbanos. Private karbanos don't exist by communal offerings, to which the Gemara says, Afilu hachi ne'echalan liyom echad adifi. Nevertheless, ultimately, again, the fact that shlamim can only be consumed for one day, that stricture makes them more kaddish. Incredible. So Gemara says, Ibailu Toda ve'el Nazir eza mehen kodem. So say, interesting enough, what about now? Toda and El Nazir were always reckoned the same. What about halacha l'maisa, Toda and El Nazir themselves? What happens in those cases? Halacha l'maisa again, Toda and El Nazir within that same category. Which one comes first? To which the Gemara says, Eza mehen kodem. To which the Gemara says, Toda kadma shekein tu'una dalid minei lechem. On one hand, Toda should come first because it requires 4 different types of loaves. O Dilma El Nazir kodem. Maybe El Nazir should come first. Why? Shekein yesh imo damim achirim. Because ultimately, I will say, there are other blood services that accompany that as well. To which the Gemara says, Tashma zu kodemes lezu. Ultimately, again, this one comes before this one. Why? The Gemara says, Shezu tu'una dalet minei lechem, v'zu eina tu'una ela shnei minei lechem. So ultimately, I will say, what comes out over here is that halacha l'maisa, the Toda will come before the El Nazir. Why? Because the Toda requires 4 types of bread, whereas the El Nazir ultimately, again, only requires 2 types of bread. Quite interesting. And therefore, again, I will say, we begin to see the illustration of this concept with all of the kabbalah. So we'll stop over here for today. There's a lot more to do, but I just want to share with you just a quick vart on the parsha as we close out the week. So so one of the most beautiful and incredible episodes that occurs in the parsha. Well, I don't know. There's many beautiful and incredible episodes that occur in the parsha. But Yaakov Avinu dispatches Yosef to go ahead and find his brothers. Right? Go seek out Lechna, Rosh Lechecha. Go see how your brothers are doing. And the Torah records, this is in Parak Lamed Zayin, Pasuk Tezvav, chapter 37, verse 15, Vayimse'ehu ish v'hinei toa basada. So Yosef is wandering around, right, because he doesn't know where his brothers are, and a man finds him. Yosef is wandering in the field. Vayisha'ehu ha'ish leimar, and the man asks him, Ma tivakesh. Yosef, what is it that you are looking for? So again, Rashi HaKadosh points out that this was no ordinary ish. Remember again, this is the second parsha in a row where we find a mysterious ish. Last week's parsha, Yaakov Avinu wrestled with an ish, was the Sarah Shal Esav. This week, Yosef finds this man. Rashi HaKadosh points out that it's no ordinary man, but rather again, it's a malach of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the malach asks him, what are you looking for? And Yosef, of course, responds, I'm looking for my brothers. Good. And the man tells him, oh, your brothers went off to pasture the sheep. You can find them here. The Katzker, Mendel of Kask, says something truly beautiful. He says, as we mentioned before, this ish was no ordinary ish. Rather, it was a malach. It was an angel. And ha-malach limed es Yosef. The malach taught Yosef a very important lesson. Shetamid kasher yiyeh toeh b'darchei achayim. There are times in life where I'm wandering around. I'm just wandering through life. And I feel a little directionless. I feel a little aimless. And I feel like I just don't know what I'm doing or where I'm going. B'shas mevuchas hanefesh. There are times in which I'm spiritually and personalistically confused. So the Rebbe says, the Malach teaches Yosef, sheyomar liatzmo, a person should say to himself, sheyavhir la'atzmo es mevukasho u'she'ifaso. A person in those moments needs to clarify one simple question. Ma tivakesh. What do you want out of life? Vayimtza'eu ish, when the ish finds Yosef, and Yosef is wandering around, he's lost. Yosef has lost his way. And the Malach says to Yosef, Ma tivakesh, what do you want out of life? If you can answer that question, what you want out of life, then no matter what life throws your way, you will get there. But if you can't answer what you want out of life, if you can't answer what you want out of yourself, then when the difficulties of life set in, you're going to get thrown all over the place. And the confusion will become more compounded. Think about this in the context of Yosef, right? Yosef didn't even understand what he was being asked, because Yosef just is going about his business. So the guy asks him, Yosef, right, I see you're lost. Ma tivakesh, what do you want out of life? So Yosef just thought the guy's asking me, what do I want right now? But what Yosef answered was fascinating. What did Yosef answer? What did Yosef want more than anything out of life? What did he want? He wanted his brothers. He wanted shalom in his family. He wanted achdos. And Yosef didn't realize that deep down, that's all he wanted out of life. And what's the godless of that? Despite the fact that just a few moments later, Yosef is robbed of his clothing, of his dignity, he's thrown into the pit and sold off like a piece of property. He is abused, mistreated for years afterwards. And when he is finally reunited with his brothers, and he has the opportunity to take retribution and vengeance, what does he do? Absolutely nothing other than shower them with love. Why? Because Yosef knew what he wanted out of life. All I want is my brothers. And when you know what you want out of life, no matter what happens, you don't lose your way. And some way, somehow, you'll get it. Says the Kotzker, what was true for Yosef is true for us as well. And listen, the reality is we go through life a lot of times without vision. Without vision. We wake up, Baruch Hashem, we learn, we daven, we do so many right things. But there's no overarching vision for like what I want to do in life. I know what I have to do today. I have to go to work. I have to do this. I have to get home in time for Shabbos. There are certain things I have to do. I'm going to have a beautiful Shabbos and beautiful, beautiful things. But there's no overarching vision. There's no overarching goal. What do I want to do, right? If life were to chas v'shalom end tomorrow, would it have been successful, not successful? Well, how do you gauge success if ultimately, again, there's no overarching vision for what I want to do with this life? Yosef not only survived, but thrived because he had a vision for who he wanted to be and what he wanted out of life. Mativakesh. The Kotzker says, if we, like Yosef, are wandering through the field of life, we have to ask ourselves as well, Mativakesh, what do we want? And to be able to answer that question, if we can answer it and develop that life vision, develop that life goal, then no matter what comes our way, as long as we have that singularity of purpose, Emirat Hashem will be successful. I will say Shkoyach and good Shabbos. Good Shabbos, everyone.